Today, I'm talking to someone who has had first-hand experience of the effects of poverty. A graduate of two of England's most prestigious universities, by which I mean Cambridge and Durham, my guest has, in the cause of Christ, spent most of her working life in far less privileged surroundings. As an Anglican priest, she has served in Newcastle upon Tyne and in former coal mining communities of Country Durham. She has ministered in inner city Liverpool, and last year she was appointed Archdeacon of Liverpool. An historian, author, and former director of Micah Liverpool, a faith-based initiative challenging social injustice and poverty, here to speak with me today is the Reverend Dr Miranda Threlfall-Holmes. Miranda, welcome. After that very long introduction, it's so lovely to see you. Thank you for your patience, by the way. It's lovely. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks, Nigel. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, Miranda. Let's start with Micah Liverpool, please, because tell us a bit about it. What is it? How did it start? What does it do? And why is it needed?
Yeah, Micah Liverpool changed its name a few years ago when it moved from being just a food bank or a food poverty initiative to include employability and so on, and brought together various initiatives as a new charity. It was originally started under the name Hope Plus, and that started about 11 years ago. It started on Valentine's Day 2013, and it held its first food bank on that first Valentine's Day at St Bride's Church in the middle of Liverpool, which is where, until about 18 months ago, I was team rector. And it started mainly because Cynthia Dowdall went to a Church Urban Fund conference and began to hear about food banks, came back and asked Nadine Daniels, who went on to run Hope for many years, asked her to do a feasibility study of what could be done in Liverpool, which of course, as everyone knows, has areas of wealth, but also considerable areas of poverty and deprivation. And when they were doing that feasibility study, my predecessor at St Bride's came to see and said, how can we help? And he showed them some evidence from the parish records at St Bride's Church. In 1919, that church had decided to provide a daily hot meal for the poor and needy of the parish. So far, so normal. What really was striking was that 20 years later, in 1939, the parish records have a reference to the decision being made to stop doing the hot meal provision because there were no longer any poor or needy in the parish.
Whoa, that must have come as a bit of a surprise.
And I think that really stunned everyone to think that, nearly 100 years later, we were having to open a food bank because there was so much poverty and need. And so originally, Hope was set up. It was a food bank. It ran out of St Bride's and also out of a local Roman Catholic church with a partnership with the two cathedrals. It also had a baby bank and a clothes bank and so on. As I say, it's now developed to also include employability and volunteering opportunities. One of the things that's been most distinctive about Hope and now Micah is that it really, from the beginning, was in partnership with the local universities. So it was able to collect really, really high quality evidence. And that fed into the Feeding Britain report. It was the most widely quoted source in Feeding Britain because actually it was one of the few food aid societies that was actually collecting that proper evidence. Led to the first regional hub, Feeding Liverpool, and has had a lot of work and continues to have a lot of work helping draw together people across this whole sector. And so Help was a founder member of the Independent Food Aid Network and so on. And that's one of the reasons why it changed its name to Micah, because the charity wanted to make the point that it wasn't simply about sticking a plaster on the need, a huge need, and that has not gone away at all. At one point, the charity was feeding 11% of all the UK's asylum seekers, absolutely astonishing numbers. But they changed the name to Micah because they also wanted to make sure that they were challenging the causes of poverty.
So here we have an example of a church, an inner city church. I think it was known as the Bombed-Out Church, wasn't it?
The Bombed-Out Church is in the centre of the parish.
I worked in Liverpool for 3 years myself, know it quite well. So here's an example then of not only a Christian community answering a need, but actually then it's interfacing with other bodies. It's becoming not only salt in its community, but it's becoming salt in the wider world and informing authorities and governments. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I love that image of salt. It's one of my favorite
Yeah,
parables or imageries in the Bible. You know, of course, the point of salt is to bring out the flavor of everything else, isn't it?
yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
you need to be distributed
Yeah.
out there so that everybody can make a difference. So yeah, it's
So,
become hugely important in terms of bringing together all sorts of different charities. There's a new collaboration called Together Liverpool, which brings together all the charities and bodies and so on who are working on helping build our communities together.
actually, what Micah is doing is replicated time and again through many churches, many Christian communities throughout the UK in terms of meeting immediate needs, with hosting food banks and providing hot meals and such like.
That's right. I mean, you know, there are various figures that are put on the value of Christian volunteering to society, but whatever it is, it's certainly enormous in monetary value in terms of volunteer hours.
Yeah.
But in a way, that's the easy bit, isn't it? You know, a lot of people, whether they're Christians or not, like helping people. It makes people feel good. It's much more challenging to try and address the causes of poverty,
Absolutely.
because then people start getting nervous that you're getting political,
Yeah.
and so on. But that's a much bigger issue that also needs tackling.
Okay, well, we might get a bit nervous and a bit political in the course of this conversation. Before we do, I mean, obviously, poverty in Liverpool is does exist. It hasn't gone away despite anybody's best efforts in the past. What kind of challenges are people facing in your city?
It's really complex, isn't it, poverty? And I think that's one
Mm,
of the things that we found. I mean, Liverpool, I'm sure, similar to many cities, that you have poverty and wealth sitting cheek by jowl. You know, so you can walk down a street near where I live, and there's a £1 million house, and then the next house is an asylum seekers hostel. You know, and they're just right next to each other. So it makes it a very, very complex situation. I think poverty is it's not just about making ends meet. That's one of the things that people who've been fortunate enough never to have much contact with poverty often don't understand. So people often say, well, you know, can't people just budget better or something? But of course, everything becomes much more difficult. I think it's like when you're living in poverty, it's like having to walk across wet sand rather than having to walk on a pavement. Just everything about life becomes much, much more difficult. Everything becomes much more expensive. I think that's one of the things that often surprises people, that when you're in poverty, you end up paying more in absolute terms for your daily basics.
yeah.
But apart from that, there's also the instability. Poverty brings a huge amount of instability in people's lives, people's housing, people's employment, people's transport options, people's families and relationships as a result of that often become much more fragmented and much more unstable. So it becomes exponentially harder for people to make plans.
Yeah.
I often
It's not knowing, isn't it? It's not knowing where the next meal's coming
It's not that,
from.
and that causes, there's been a lot of research recently that causes a huge amount of stress,
Yeah.
which has, absolute medical implications. It makes it literally harder to make decisions,
Yeah.
literally harder to do anything.
Yeah. Now we spoke there about some food banks. I saw some figures the other day. There are somewhere in the region of 3,000 food banks in the UK today. Some are run by about 1,100 are run by the Trussell Trust, but the balance, the independents, are run by other community groups, many of which we've already said are
Yeah.
churches and faith
And
communities.
it's not just food banks as well. I mean, increasingly, one of the things that Micah was pioneering a few years ago were community markets, which have now really taken off as
Yeah.
well. Which
Yeah.
so instead of simply just giving people food as a short-term sticking plaster, you help provide limit food waste by taking things that are not being wanted by shops, but also give people a choice and some sort of dignity in being able to stretch their budget further.
So, according to recent figures, the UK is the sixth richest country in the world. As you say, in your own city, £1 million houses, cheek by jowl with asylum seeker accommodation. You've got people in your city who earn tens of thousands of pounds to, as my mother might once have said, kick a bladder of wind around a football pitch. And yet you've got people who don't know where the next meal's coming from. How morally defensible is it that the sixth richest country in the world has millions of people, 3 million people, according to one source, who regularly use food banks? How morally defensible is that in
Yeah,
this society?
I don't think it's morally defensible at all. Um, I don't blame the footballers. I mean, actually, the football clubs both work together to help tackle food poverty and are incredibly generous in having match day collections for the food banks and so on. But it's totally indefensible for the sixth richest economy in the world to be having this level of need. It's a moral choice that our society is making, and it's made up of all sorts of little moral choices that people are making, often each individually, very understandable. You know, people vote because they don't necessarily want to pay higher taxes. They want to make sure they and their children are okay. Those are all really normal human things. But it seems to me that the Christian worldview is fundamentally really challenging to that basic human nature of wanting to protect ourselves. It calls us to not make choices in our own self-interest, but to make choices about the kind of fair society we want to live in.
It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, that's really what the kingdom of heaven's about, and Jesus teaching about first being last and last first, and except you become a little child, you won't see the kingdom of heaven. It's all about might not being right.
But it's, you know, part of the problem is that when we think about people who are wealthy and people who are poor, our brains can only imagine, you know, a certain amount of disparity. So we imagine people being wealthy, like we imagine if we were really well off, how much money would we have? Yeah. Our brains cannot conceptualize what it is to be a billionaire. No. You know, it's just so ridiculously more money than being a multi-millionaire. You know, a billionaire could be taxed, you know, half of their income each year, and they wouldn't even notice. They would still make money because their money would just be earning so much more money. So we've got a system which is designed because people quite like to think that they might become wealthy, but it just isn't working with the way that money is distributed in our current society.
Well, let's talk about maybe an attitude that comes from people with money, billionaires, multimillionaires, and those of lesser means, those who have got a bit of cash in the bank and are financially secure. I've heard it said by a merchant banker years ago. Well, of course, those people who are in poverty, you know, they bring it upon themselves. They've made bad lifestyle choices. They're to blame. You can't go chucking money at them because they don't know how to use it. They'll only waste it. So how accurate an assessment is that as a cause of poverty?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because that's a really comforting thought. I would love to think that anyone who's poor has brought it on themselves, because it means I don't need to worry that I'm going to become poor, and it means I don't need to feel any sense of responsibility for it. And of course, you know, in individual cases, you can always come up with examples, but it's not very accurate when you look statistically at how people are living. Most people living in poverty, when you do the research, find themselves there after one or two incidents of bad luck. It might be a cancer diagnosis. Yep. It might be a company going bust. It might be, you know, an ill child or an ill spouse that needs looking after, so you have to give up your job to do that. All sorts of things. Or you find yourself on the wrong end of a miscarriage of justice, like the people we saw with the Horizon scandal and so on. Yes, and suddenly you spend all your money trying to clear your name. Poverty generally happens after one or two incidents of bad luck. The problem is then it's really, really hard to get out of it. I like to use the image of a muddy pit or a sort of bear trap. You know, it's really easy to fall in without really noticing that it's in front of you. And okay, you could say, well, maybe you should have been more careful. But actually, you know, people can so easily fall in. And then it's really, really hard to get yourself out. Yeah, much easier to get in than to come out.
Yes, I think there's a sort of a kind of a I suppose these days we'd call it a trope or a meme, but there's this concept that actually each of us is only like 2 or 3 decisions away from being at the, you know, from being in poverty or for being at the bottom of the ladder, however you wish to frame it.
That's right. I mean, there's something like a quarter of middle-income families, you know, are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have considerable savings, and one or two things going wrong could suddenly mean they couldn't meet their mortgage payments. Then they could be out on the street, and you get this whole kind of cascade. A lot of, you know, when I grew up, there was quite a big safety net. A lot of that has been eroded. So a lot of people now, you know, I've just turned 50. You know, a lot of people who grew up like me will still think, if they haven't been unfortunate enough to need it, that the safety net that was there when they were in their 20s still exists, and are really startled to discover that it doesn't anymore.
No, of course, last week we had a budget, much trailed and much, on occasions, a bit leaked as to what was going to happen. Now, over the years, from the poor laws of the 16th and 18th centuries to the introduction of the welfare state post Second World War, governments have introduced legislation to address the challenges of poverty. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation calculates that today poverty levels are at a 20-year low. So, post-budget, we could ask, has the government done enough? More generally, we can say, what can the present government do to help alleviate poverty in the UK? What's the answer, Miranda? Be controversial.
Well, if I was Chancellor, I don't think
we have a lady Chancellor. Why not?
Absolutely.
You know, she's
I don't think it's a bad budget. But I think that the top priority that I think is disappointing, the top priority that would make the most difference, I think, is scrapping the 2-child limits on child benefits. That's the top priority of the End Child Poverty Coalition, which is an alliance of over 100 children's and anti-poverty charities. Save the Children last year estimated that child poverty actually costs the UK economy 39 billion a year. So they reckon if you scrap that 2-child limit, you'd lift 250,000 children out of the poverty trap directly, and long term actually save money. I'm also quite persuaded. I was at the Greenbelt Festival last year. I don't know if you've ever been. And there was
I've heard of it many a time.
Absolutely brilliant. They have quite a big economic strategy strands in the last few years. And I've spent quite a lot of time last year in the tent hosted by the Just Money movement. I was really persuaded by quite a lot of their ideas. It's a Christian coalition to look particularly at money and tax from a justice perspective. They're calling for a one-off wealth tax, and I was really quite persuaded by that. There's an organisation called Patriotic Millionaires, believe it or not, which is a group of UK millionaires, people who own more than £1 million, who are calling for a one-off wealth tax, as well as Tax Justice UK and other groups. They reckon the government could raise up to £60 billion by just having a 1 or 2% tax on wealth. So that means, you know, not income, but assets that are just sitting in the bank or land that people own. And that would make a huge difference. So I think those two things really would be my top priorities.
So a little bit like a windfall tax.
Yeah.
You know, in the past, governments, you know, it's been oil or natural gas or something. Somebody's made enormous profits.
I mean, in the past, you know, in the past, people, you know, what the definition of a gentleman was that you lived on your income. You had money in the bank and you just used the income from it. Most people now earn their money, but the richest people don't. They simply get money coming in without doing anything from the interest. So it would be taking a small percentage of that money that was just sitting there in banks, not contributing to our economy, and using it to help make a difference in the world.
Do you think, you know, to what extent is it the government's job to help people in poverty? Is it? I mean, you say that there is a financial deficit to poverty, towards the sort of the national wealth. Is it any more than, does the government have any more, a wider responsibility other than trying to get more money out of people?
It's a really interesting philosophical question, isn't it? I mean, what is the point of government? That is a really interesting philosophical question. You know, a very simple minimalist view would say that the point of government is national security, effectively. Yeah. So, you know, historically taxes were only raised in order to fight wars or defence. And there's definitely a case to be made for limiting the inequality that we see in society as a factor towards national security, because it keeps a happier and more content population. Whether governments have, what government's moral and philosophical responsibility is, I think, a question that we really need to be having as a discussion. It's something that our current system of politics, which is so focused on a 5-year election cycle and short-termism, doesn't really allow politicians to address what are they actually there for. And I think it's
I beg your pardon, you spoke earlier about the self-interest of the voter, but there's also the self-interest of the politician. When I used to interview Christian MPs many years ago, one of the again, the meme was, you know, first rule of politics, get yourself re-elected. And so there is, as you rightly say, there is a sort of a short-term approach, and yet some of the big problems cannot be served and cannot be solved by. It's like the social care budget, isn't it? I mean, you know, we've been talking. We know we have a coming up social care crisis, particularly for the elderly population. But no, you know, there's been talk for 20 years about cross-party getting together and getting
Exactly.
some solutions.
Some of these things
But
are really long term, and they need a cross-party collaboration and a commitment across all the parties on, 20, 30, 40-year plan and elements of the budget that isn't going to be sacrificed to short-term party interests. Sadly, we just have not been seeing that. And I'd love to think it can change. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm actually, although in many ways it doesn't make sense to still have the House of Lords as it is, it's one of the reasons why I'm slightly loath to say let's get rid of it, because it would end up meaning that the only element of our politics was based on a short-term election cycle, whereas at least at the moment we have a second chamber, which, although it is very political and the hereditary element doesn't really make sense, actually there is an element of our political system which is outside of that cycle. But it's a big issue that we have, the short-term interest of governments.
There has been recent criticism of, I mean, you mentioned the two-child benefit cap. There's also been recent criticism of the withdrawal of winter fuel payments to all pensioners. Only those who are already on some sort of form of credit or already receive some sort of benefit will be due a payment this winter. And many pressure groups have said actually this is going to actually drive more people to make the choice between heat and eat. To what extent should a government target financial assistance only to those most in need?
This is a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's interesting because I don't think this is actually a moral question. I think this is more of a mathematical question. Because in theory, it makes perfect sense to target benefits just to those that need them. I mean, when we talk about pensioners, there's a real two-tier level of pensioners at the moment. There are pensioners who are really, really struggling, and there are pensioners who retired on their baby boomer pensions and are doing brilliantly. There's an issue of intergenerational fairness there. So simply lumping pensioners together isn't very helpful. But I remember when child benefit, there was a discussion about making child benefits means tested. And there was quite a lot of research done that found that it was actually more expensive to means test it. It was actually cheaper and more efficient.
Because you've got administrative costs.
Because you've got the administrative costs, you've got huge administrative costs, and you end up with some people who need it not asking for it. But overall, it actually ended up being cheaper just to give it at a flat rate to everyone. Now, I assume that the government have actually made those calculations with the fuel payments, and it does make sense. And certainly, I mean, there are a lot of pensioners I know who don't need it and have said, well, I didn't need it anyway. So I think it is simply really quite a practical, pragmatic question as to which is more efficient with our tax money.
Now, we were talking earlier about food banks and face-to-face help for people who are in poverty, where churches and faith communities are involved. Historically, the governments have looked to charities and churches, what's known as the third sector, to be the delivery agents of some welfare policies, either through official contracts or to be a safety net for those who have nowhere else to turn. But if charities keep on doing this, if churches keep on doing this, will governments ever address the systemic issue? If the churches are always the band-aid, to use a charitable term of 40 years ago, if we're always the band-aid, will society change?
It's a really live question for the charities that I'm involved in and the churches I'm involved in, is this kind of moral dilemma between, can you ignore the person in front of you? But then if you do, are you actually simply helping prop up an unjust system? I think in your introduction to that question, though, you conflated two very different things. The government expecting the church to just step into the gaps they leave, and thus perhaps rather cynically deliberately leaving gaps because it'll be cheaper to let other people do them. That's a real problem, partly because it creates a bit of a postcode lottery. We go back to the problem that we had in the poor laws that you mentioned earlier at the 16th, 17th century, the Elizabethan poor laws. One local village might do a really good job, another local village with a very different primary landowner might do a very different job. But it also, of course, when you have, we have a very unequal society. So we have areas which are really, really poor and areas which are really quite wealthy, as well as having mix within those senses. If you leave it purely to local agencies to relieve poverty, then you end up with the poorest communities having to pick up the bill for helping the poorest people. And you're not doing that sort of basic redistribution, which I think everybody with an innate sense of fairness would expect to be happening. It's not fair for some, we've got many, many parishes which are in the poorest 1% of local authority areas. If they, if it's left to them, they're really generous. We all know, don't we, when you look at church giving, people in the poorest areas actually give more in absolute terms, not just in relative terms, than people in wealthy areas. But people end up being expected to really have to care for their neighbours in poor areas and having to do a lot more of that at a time when they're already stressed. But the other point you made, which was the government using local charities as effectively local partners, giving them contracts to deliver. And that, I think, is a much more fruitful model. And we see that's the model that a lot of development charities use, isn't it? People like Christian Aid, USPG, Oxfam will use local agencies on the basis that, this is not about paternalism. This is about partnering with people locally who know what they need. Actually, so I think government's doing that is very sensible.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick you up. You mentioned about caring for one's neighbour, and of course that's a very Christian. In fact, it's part of the great commandment to love your neighbour as yourself, says Jesus. So, Miranda, do you, in your experience, and as we said, you've ministered in different parts of the country as an Anglican priest, and yet you always seem to be at the coalface of people in great need in terms of poverty. Is there, would you say, a distinctive Christian response to poverty and people who are struggling financially?
I think there is, and I'd say it in two parts. I mean, first, going back to the neighbour point, I mean, yes, Jesus says love your neighbour, and that's something that most people, Christian or not, quite naturally feel drawn to. But of course, in the story of the Good Samaritan, what Jesus went on to say was your neighbour isn't just the person who looks like you and lives next door and that you're friends with. Your neighbour is anybody, the stranger, the person from a different ethnic background, anyone in need. That's quite challenging, and I think that is quite a distinctive approach. We don't necessarily always live up to it, but I think that's what we should be aiming for.
It's something to aim for, isn't it?
It's something to aim for. But the other thing that I think is really distinctive about Christian belief is that Christian belief about God is that God voluntarily chose to become poor for us in Jesus. That's incredibly challenging. It's incredibly countercultural. It was something that the religions around at the time of Jesus, the pagan religions and so on, just found incomprehensible. And it means that Christianity has quite a rich theology of poverty. Traditionally, a lot of pre-Christian religion, and we see this now in kind of prosperity gospel stuff, which is perennially tempting, saw poverty and wealth as quite simplistic. If you were poor, then you weren't blessed by God. If you were wealthy, it was a sign that you were blessed by God. Really, Christian theology turns that on its head. And Jesus taught that whatever you do for someone in poverty, you're doing for Jesus. So I think a distinctively Christian response to poverty isn't just about being generous and doing good to the poor. It's about seeing Christ in the face of anyone who's poor and doing it for God.
Yeah. It's the cup of cold water in my name that Jesus talks about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, our question today is, will the poor always be with us? So before we turn to the many listener questions that are coming in, Miranda, will the poor always be with us?
Two answers to that. One, I think it's up to us. Poverty is a result of choices that we make individually, but more importantly, as a society. When Jesus said the poor will always be with you, which sometimes gets quoted as why are you bothering to try and get rid of poverty? Jesus said the poor would always with you. We've got to remember the context that he said that in. He was responding, I think, probably quite sarcastically. The woman had just poured the ointment over his feet, and people were saying, why did you let her do that? It could have been sold and given to the poor. Yeah, and I think he was saying, well, that was not your only opportunity to help the poor. You can carry on doing it. If you want to help the poor, don't criticize her. You go and do it. Be my guest. There are plenty of people for you to go and help.
Absolutely.
So, it's about choices we make. But of course, the other question is, what do we mean by poverty? Because part of the question, and one of the things that we know governments can do a bit of sleight of hand on this, is, are you defining poverty as a certain standard of living? Are you defining it as being able to clothe and feed yourself, or are you defining it relatively? One of the things that I think is so of course, if you're defining it relatively, then by definition, the poor are always going to be with us, because they're always going to be half the population, 50% less than the average income.
Yes.
You know, that's how averages work.
Indeed.
But if we mean, will there always be people who are destitute, people who are starving to death, people who are freezing to death because they're having to choose between eating and heating? That is definitely a political choice that we're making, and I very much hope the answer is no.
Right, let's get to the post bag. There's lots here, Miranda. So let's see how many of these we can get through.
Okay.
Short and sharp. Short and sharp. Okay.
Quick fire round.
Quick fire. Thank you very much. You may phone a friend if you need to, please. Right. Jesus calls us to be salt in the world. We've just been speaking about that. What happens, asks Simon from Ealing, what happens when Christians don't do that and keep the salt to themselves? When we don't pass the salt, what happens?
Yeah, well, salt isn't much use, is it? I mean, if you've got your big kitchen salt thing and it just sits in there, then your meat doesn't get seasoned. You don't end up bringing. I love the imagery of salt, as I said earlier. Salt's about, it preserves things, doesn't it? It saves things, quite literally, and it brings flavor. You know, whenever you watch something like MasterChef, they're always saying, you know, you've under seasoned that steak or whatever. So it just isn't doing anything if it's just kept in the pot of the church.
So we all have a responsibility then, isn't it? It's not the church, is it? It's not the church. It's individual Christians.
It's not the, yeah, there is no the church apart from individual Christians. There is no church without us. It is us. We need to be out there sprinkling it.
We would agree. We all have a responsibility. Okay, here's a message. No name, but they are listening. And it goes like this. I never understand why the UK tolerates homelessness. Shouldn't we mandate that everyone should have a roof over their heads? What do you think needs to change? So
it's interesting, isn't it? Because in COVID, suddenly we did.
Clarify.
In the COVID pandemic, suddenly there was a moment, there were a few months where it was mandated that all homeless people, and they were obviously, we happened to have empty hotels, so it was a complex. You know, it wasn't a situation we can just replicate the rest of the time. But homeless people were housed. It is possible. It requires political will. It also requires a lot more than simply a roof. I think that's one of the things that anyone who's worked with homelessness will say. You know, sometimes people are homeless simply because they can't afford a house or can't find a house. Yeah. You know, and in that case, giving them a house, brilliant, solves the problem. For a lot of people, it is often more complex, and they'll need quite a lot of support to help work out how to live in a house. There's a lot of complexity that comes with living in a house, knowing how to pay council tax, deal with bills, all that kind of thing. So a lot of support is needed. So there's a lot more complex support around it, but it would absolutely be possible to do.
And I guess I know from my own experience as a Salvation Army officer that actually it's not just the house, it's the causes of homelessness.
Absolutely.
And some people are on the streets because of trauma, past trauma. They are suffering emotionally. They're suffering financially. They are suffering mentally.
And people are often very, very traumatized. So in Liverpool, we have the council has a brilliant system of shelters and, you know, a nobody left outside policy, even if that doesn't come with any government funding. Yeah. But we will still find a lot of people will refuse to go into the shelters because they don't feel safe there. They feel traumatized. They're struggling to maybe stay away from drugs, and they're worried that if they go into the shelters, they'll have them again, or they've got a pet with them.
That is a very real fear, isn't it?
It's a very real fear. You know, people are scared. If someone's traumatized because they've run away from sexual abuse or domestic violence, the last thing they want to do is put themselves in a room full of 20 strangers who they don't know how they're going to treat them. So it is complex. It's not as straightforward as simply rounding everybody up. And of course, you've got to think about people's autonomy as well. Often when people say we don't want homelessness, what we mean, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, is it makes us feel really uncomfortable walking past someone sitting on the street, and we would prefer that to be tidied away. Yes. But I think it would not be the kind of society I'd want to live in, to tell people they weren't allowed to be there if that's what they wanted, and instead had to accept some government mandated solution. I think there should be more solutions, but we also need to be aware of people's autonomy.
Yeah. A very big issue, and one that again has not gone away over the years. As you say, seasonally, you know, COVID, not so many people living on the streets. Christmas shelters come and go, as we well know, in many of our major cities. But there is still an underlying It's not a trend, but there's an underlying level of poverty that sees people on the street.
And it's difficult. When I first came to my church here in Liverpool, I came into a plan to have a winter homelessness project across several churches. So on a Monday, one church would house people, on a Tuesday, and it fell apart really because it was just too complicated and difficult. We didn't have the skilled volunteers to run it. It's all very well saying, "Oh, come in," but actually, what do you then do if someone is abusing somebody? What do you then do if someone's pushing drugs? You've got to have people there who really are competent, and we just didn't have the resources to be able to run it safely.
Yeah. Now, another question, slightly different topic. Moving away from holiness. This is a general one from Claire in Shepherd's Bush. A lovely, lovely idea here. For churches that want to engage better with their communities, what practical steps can they take? Now, you've just been speaking there about how difficult it is to find the right kind of people with the right kind of skills for some possible clients. So what can churches do to better engage?
I would say the first thing to do is to do a bit of an audit of what there already is in your community. Churches are terrible, and I think perhaps the Church of England is particularly bad at thinking we need to start a church project and stick our church name on it and do something, and ignore the fact that there are already 5 or 6 different agencies in the area who are already working together or doing things that it would be much more efficient for us to join in with. Yeah. So I would say first, find out what there is, do a bit of an audit, and then either join in with that or perhaps use the convening power that churches do still have to bring all those agencies together and find out what would most help them, rather than going in with a kind of well-meaning, this will make us feel better about ourselves and make our church look good.
It's a strategic approach then, isn't it? It's what's already happening. And sadly, some churches aren't aware of what other ministries are happening in their towns or cities.
No, and it's often hard to find out because a lot of these things go quite under the radar for all sorts of quite sad but very realistic reasons. If you're working with, say, asylum seekers, or you're working with domestic abuse victims, there are many reasons not to publicise that too much because of the level of hate crime that can come about with it. But I do feel that often churches have quite mixed motivations in wanting to get involved in this work. There's love for neighbour, which is brilliant, but there can also be oh, will this make us look good? Will this make us feel better about ourselves? Will this, help our brand as a church, if that doesn't sound too cruel? And I think, we've got to be honest about those mixed motivations, and we need to directly challenge them in ourselves and go, what would be most efficient here with maybe the handful of volunteers, the small amount of money that we've got access to? And it's probably going to be working with someone else rather than starting your own thing.
Now, here's somebody from the West Midlands. They ask, should the government subsidise the church to do the work it's already doing to help support the poor through the likes of food banks, homeless shelters, support for refugees, and so on?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Subsidise is quite an emotive word that can annoy all sorts of funding bodies. Yeah. I think what you said earlier, Nigel, about working in partnership with local agencies and giving contracts for things that the government want delivered to people who are on the ground and are best placed to be doing that and already have those contacts is a really, really good model. I do think that there probably should be much more government funding for the church buildings, out of which so much of this work is run, and without which so much of this work simply couldn't happen. That's across all denominations. There's just so many churches are spending so much of their resources keeping a building going, not so much because they need it for their worship, but because if they close the building, the food bank would have to close. Where would the local refugee charity meet? Where would the women's aid meet? So I think subsidy for these spaces, which are often in many of the communities around me, these are often the last spaces that you can go into on a non-commercial basis.
Yes. Yeah, they're the hubs, aren't they?
Yeah.
The community hubs.
The community hubs.
And as you haven't stated it, but you're suggesting it, that actually church buildings, many of them are old, need an awful lot of money to maintain. I mean, who hasn't gone into a cathedral and been asked to part with £5–10 just to visit? Yeah,
there's two different things, aren't there? I mean, I think there's requests for the government to help with churches which are considered an important part of our heritage. That, in a way, is a separate issue. I think that would be helpful. Most people don't want the beautiful church in the middle of the village to not be there. Yeah, so that's a heritage issue. But then there's also this hub issue. And I think there would be a lot to be said for taking a strategic view in any particular area as to which church or churches in a particular area are best placed to be community hubs across all the denominations.
Yeah.
And which are the most sensible ones to fund for that work. And then, I mean, frankly, I wish we were doing a lot more ecumenically, you know, come together ecumenically, pool all our resources in a few hubs, rather than trying to maintain lots and lots of different buildings just because historically we've got attractions to them.
Yeah, exactly. Here's one from Chris in Uxbridge. About the Church of England. What is the Church of England doing about poverty at a national level? And what do you think the Church of England could be doing better? Let's just restrict it, if I may, to the issue of poverty. Okay. I'm sure you have.
I want to say hello, Chris from Uxbridge. I was born and brought up in Uxbridge.
Oh, there we go.
For the first 9 years of my life
today, folks. So, what can the Church of England do about poverty at the national level?
Well, the Church of England specifically works has particular charities which are part of it. So, you know, the Children's Society is the Church of England's charity that works particularly around issues of child poverty and child deprivation. A lot now on mental health as well. And there are various other charities. There's a big project that the Church of England's working on centrally at the moment around housing and homelessness and how we can use perhaps underused church assets to help create more social housing and partner with social housing agencies. Obviously, at the moment, the Church of England has this particular historic position of having bishops in the House of Lords. And I know that they particularly feel that their responsibility is to speak into that second chamber from their experience and the experiences reported to them across the diocese of what life is really like for people on the ground. So as long as that particular privileged position stays, there's that sense of being able to really report from the front line into the corridors of power.
But the church is also one of the biggest. Sorry, the Church of England, beg your pardon. Just to be clear, the Church of England is one of the biggest landowners in the country, isn't it? It's one of the biggest landlords in the country. It holds buildings, it holds treasures. In many respects, the Church of England is, and the church, let's just take a heat out of this slightly. The church as a whole nationally is actually rich.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because it's not. It's a bit like the discussion about farmers. You know, farmers are rich, but most farmers don't feel rich. You know, because
absolutely.
you've only got the money if you sell the land. You know?
And you'd have to pay inheritance tax these days.
Well, I mean, you know, quite right. I'm all for inheritance tax, but you know, it's not liquid assets. A lot of what churches hold in terms of buildings and treasures, you know, people are always saying that, why don't you sell a church and then you could do X, Y, Z. Yeah, it's actually really hard to sell a church. Most people don't want them. They cost a huge amount of money to convert into something useful. So they don't tend to actually have very much commercial value. They have far more value in heritage and community asset terms than they do in commercial terms. In terms of the Church of England having a large amount of land, that's quite specifically the Church Commissioners, which is a separate charity that's effectively a trust fund, right, the income of which funds the Church of England. It's a really complicated system that was set up by the Crown in centuries past. So there is a lot of money. The Church Commissioners do work very, very hard on making their land something that gives social value as well as financial value. But they're constrained by charity law and what they can do with it. So they don't have the option, bar an act of parliament, to change this. They don't have the option to simply say, oh, we'll spend all this money on relieving poverty, because if you're a charity, you have to spend the money on the in perpetuity cause of that charity.
You can't have it one big
no.
spend.
So what the Church Commissioners are working on at the moment, I'm on a group at the moment that's trying to work on this, is how can they use the income that they're predicting to have from those assets over the next 3 years to really help the churches locally become more sustainable, become more able to help in their local communities, and help them invest in justice assets and in using what we've got locally to be able to really make a difference. So they're trying to do that strategic work and target what they're doing with their money in order to support local churches making a difference locally.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for maybe one more. So here it is. Listener says, foreign aid budget is in excess of about £13 billion a year. although it's been cut recently. It's now 0.5% of gross national income. In other words, the country's wealth. Charity begins at home. Should charity begin at home? Should we be spending money that we send out to the other parts of the world? Should be spending that to
three
relieve
things.
poverty?
There was a commitment many years ago for the foreign aid budget to be 0.7%, wasn't there? And
Yes.
It was cut and has not yet regained that value. Second point, I do think, I said earlier, there's a big philosophical debate to be had about what the purpose of government is, but actually one of the key purposes of national governments is our national security. And my sense is that the foreign aid budget is primarily about keeping the world a relatively safe, stable place, in order to protect us. So I think it is actually in our self-interest to do that foreign aid, if you want to take a very cynical view of it. But I think that is true, and it's partly why governments do it. But thirdly, it does not say in the Bible that charity begins at home. That is the exact opposite of the point of the parable of the Samaritan, and Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? Your neighbor is anyone who needs something. And I mean, if I had a penny for every time someone said charity begins at home, as if that was a Christian virtue, I mean, it really isn't, is it? Charity begins at home, in that charity begins with our choosing what we do with our own money, and choosing to give generously and sacrificially of our own resources to those in need.
It begins in the home of our heart.
Begins in our hearts, but there's no Christian imperative to help those nearer to us rather than those further away.
Thank you. My guest today has been Reverend Dr. Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, the Archdeacon of Liverpool. Now, at the same time next week, I will be talking to the Bishop of London, that is the Right Reverend Dame Sarah Mullally, when we will be discussing the question, is well-being more than skin deep? I so hope you'll be able to join us. Questions of Our Times is brought to you by the Christian Evidence Society. To catch up with this or any of the previous seasons, please visit christianevidence.org or premier.plus. Until we meet again, thank you for listening.